called Bokashi composting. There's a bunch of leftover stuffing from the holidays. All right, YouTube gardeners, I've got some stuff piled on the table here before me. This is kind of an interesting way of composting you may have heard of. It's called Bokashi composting. And I prefer to make my own Bokashi bran just because I prefer to not spend the money on store-bought bran. But I'm going to go over my way of doing it, and it has worked for me many times in the past, so I'm convinced that the homemade version works just fine. To start off, the ingredients, the tools you're going to need is a spoon to stir with, 1 cup of white rice, not minute rice, a strainer or sieve, a mason jar, 2 cups of unchlorinated water. I use stuff from our reverse osmosis system, but you can also use bottled water. That would give you 2 cups. Or you can use distilled water that you can buy from the grocery store. There is another way around that. If you get a cup of water or some water in an open container and leave it out for 24 hours, the chlorine will off gas and it'll be gone within about 24 hours later. You're safe to use it. Or from Dr. Elaine Ingham, she mentioned that if you have some liquid humic acid, if you put that in there, it binds the chlorine and makes it so it's not going to cause any problems, killing bacteria or anything like that. But in this particular experiment, I wouldn't use humic acid, so we're going to stick to filtered water, and I'm going to tell you the steps to go through from here. So first, you're going to add this 1 cup of rice to the water, and I'm just going to stir this until it starts to get cloudy. What we're making here is basically a solution that the yeast, just natural yeast that's in the air, is going to be able to get in, colonize, multiply, and have some food to feed on. That's what this kind of, we'll call it rice milk. That's what that's going to be for. Okay, so that looks plenty milky now. Go ahead and set this aside. Use the sieve. I'm going to just pour out so we put the water into this clean mason jar. Now this rice has been rinsed. Starches and everything are off of it. You can go cook it without having it be too starchy. That's the way I prefer to eat my rice. When I cook rice, I always like to rinse it first. This particular rice is jasmine rice. Doesn't really matter, as long as it's white rice that's not instant rice or something. Okay, so now we have our rice milk. And the last step for this is, at this point, is to put cheesecloth. I've got rough hands. The cheesecloth sticks to my little calloused fingers. So cheesecloth over it, and I like to put a rubber band on it just to keep it secure. Then I'm going to go stick this in a cabinet or a cupboard in a cool, dark place. I'm going to keep it there for 1 week. At that point, I'm going to add a ratio of 10 parts milk to 1 part of the rice wash. An easier way to think about that is 2.4 ounces of the rice wash to every 24 ounces of milk. And I do that until I'm about out of the rice wash, and I don't do that last, whatever's less than 2.4 ounces. So I do that, and then I put that back in a jar, or I put the cheesecloth back on the jar, and then I put it back in a cool, dark place again for another 2 weeks at that point. And during that 2 weeks, we are creating a bacteria that's called lactobacillus. Bacteria are what we're kind of culturing in that water and milk and rice wash bins. So we are culturing that. That'll sit there sit there culturing for 2 weeks. And when that's done, at that point you need to mix it with 12 cups of water, again non-chlorinated. With that much water, you probably want to just get the 12 cups pre-measured and let it sit out overnight, so you're not using a bunch of plastic water bottles. Or if you have a reverse osmosis filter system, that works as well. So the 12 cups of water, 1/4 cup of molasses, and 1/4 cup of whey. When you get that rice wash with milk in there, it's going to separate and look kind of like cheese curds and the liquid. The liquid part is whey. So you want to save 1/4 cup of the whey that's from that jar. And then at that point, you need to mix it with some of the bran. I keep calling it bran, but the shredded paper is what I use. You can mix it with the shredded paper, and then you put it in a dark plastic bag. Tie it up real tight, get all the air out that you can, and then let that sit for 2 more weeks. At that point, it is ready. If you're ready to use a bunch of it, you can use it when it's moist, but it's preferred to dry it out. and then it can store for a long time. So you put that Bokashi that's damp, you put it all on like a tarp or something. I prefer doing it in my garage because it's too stinky to do in my house. I don't like the smell of it very much. And then you just let it dry out. You don't want to do it outside necessarily because the wind and the sun, UV rays can damage some of the bacteria, things like that. So I do it in my garage, let it air out completely dry, and then I put it in a bin. As I mentioned earlier, a tote bin that has a rubber gasket that totally seals it, so it's an airtight bin. There are other ways of going about this. You can buy the bran, and you can buy what's called EM1 or effective microbes 1. Those, you can find those on Amazon or other places. And those microbes that come in EM1, you just mix those with the bran, or you can buy that and mix that with your shredded paper. If you're not into doing the cultures and the rice wash and the yeast gathering, all that stuff, then you can buy the EM1, mix that with your bran or your shredded paper, and then you're already to the step of putting it in a plastic bag, letting it sit there airtight for 2 weeks, and then drying it out and using you're done. So there's many ways you can do this, or you can just buy the bran that's already been inoculated and use it that way. So that's the easiest route to go. I kind of like just the way I am. I like doing these experiments. I like seeing if I can make it and see if I can get it to work. I've done this plenty of times and it works for me every time. So I'm confident that the way I'm doing it is effective. I have some Bokashi bran that's already made that I'll bring into the picture frame here in just a minute, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. I did forget to mention that the reason you put cheesecloth over the mason jar is because it just kind of keeps the big dust and a lot of that stuff out. But there's natural yeasts that are just floating around along with everything else in the air that you don't want to know about necessarily. And so the yeast will be able to make it through all the pores and the holes, if you will, in the cheesecloth. You don't want to use a really tight knit cloth or anything like that. You need to let it have oxygen, so you don't want to put a lid on it. But I just wouldn't do a regular fabric or washcloth or anything that's just too tight. You might not have good success with getting the yeast in there. So that jar that I've got the cheesecloth on, I put that in a cool, dark place, and I'm going to keep it there for a week. After a week, I'm going to take it out. I'm going to add, once you've got the Bokashi bran already, what I use is, though, as I mentioned, is shredded cardboard and shredded paper that I put through a cross-cut shredder, and this is what it looks like. Shredded paper, and it smells like fermentation. It's kind of the sour smell, not really like sauerkraut, but it kind of has that smell to it, sour like that, not like sour milk. It doesn't stink like that. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure I have a bucket. Actually, the first thing before any of this gets going, I'm going to have a bucket that has a bunch of holes drilled in the bottom, and another bucket that doesn't have any holes in it. Stick a rock in the bottom of that one, or a brick or something. That way when you stack them down in here and you've got the food in there, if the food is producing any juices, that's why you have the holes in the bottom of the top bucket. And if they are leaking through, you don't want the bucket sitting in the juices, and that would just make things start to rot and get funky. So you have the bucket with the holes in it. I prefer to get this bucket and lid combo that has a rubber gasket on it. You can see the rubber gasket right here. And that screws on versus having to break your fingernails every time you try to get the regular bucket lids off. And it ensures an airtight seal. So the bacteria that we're going to be dealing with are anaerobic bacteria. There's anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Aerobic means with oxygen. The bacteria we're dealing with here are all anaerobic bacteria. So we need to keep things airtight. That's the environment that they live in. And once they've done their job, once they've pre-composted or fermented the food that we put in here with them via this Bokashi bran. I call it bran because that's what it's sold as when you buy it in the stores. So I'm going to put a layer of this bran in, and then I'll put a layer of the food in, and I'll just keep alternating that at about 1 to 2 inch levels. And once I get to the top, once the bin's full, I'll seal it off and I'll let it sit for 2 weeks. Just let the fermentation process take over, and at that point it's ready to either go out into your soil or go into your compost and finish composting. And you'll let it out of the bucket so it'll then receive air. All of the anaerobic bacteria will die, but it's perfect conditions and pre-composted, and that puts it to a point where the regular bacteria that you have in compost piles or in the soil, all the good beneficial bacteria, it's like a smorgasbord for them. They can just go to town on it, and I'm not kidding you. You can bury this in your soil. If you have good living soil, You can bury it in the soil and come back less than a week later and it's almost gone. Like all but the hardiest of things like banana stems or avocado pits or something like that. All of but everything but the hardest stuff is gone. It's amazing stuff. If you do put it in straight into your soil, you have to wait at least 2 weeks to plant. That way you give things in the soil where you buried it a chance to level out and it's safer to plant them. It's not a good environment for your plant roots to be growing in when it's actively breaking down. And you need to wait for it to kind of turn into composted soil and let the bacteria do their thing to make it good for plants. All right, so as I mentioned, I've got some food that's gone bad over the holidays. Haven't eaten enough of it, made way too much, couldn't eat it all, doesn't freeze well type food. Something that's already been thawed and frozen, something that was hiding in the back of the fridge, and some other stuff that was just not edible after sitting in the fridge for too long. And so I've been saving that food, and any food that's kitchen scraps, instead of dumping it in the garbage when you're done or dumping it in the disposal and washing it down the drain, anything like that. Anything that won't go in the compost bin, the regular compost bin, you can put in here. You can put meat, you can put fats, you can put dairy, you can put all of that stuff in here. There's two things that you can't put in a bin like this. You can't put mold. Anything that's molding, you don't want to put in there because mold can actually dominate the bacteria that we're trying to work for and overpower that and end up just making a big moldy mess instead of fermented Bokashi composted stuff. The other thing you can't put in there is human waste. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take a bunch of this bran, stick it in the bottom of the bucket. I'm going to move the bucket down here so I'm not. Again, I'm going to put about an inch or two in the bottom. Go ahead and start piling the leftovers or the food in there. It does help. The more broken up food is, just like with the compost, the more broken up things are, the faster the bacteria can get to work on it. I'm going to break things up a little bit as I dump them in. That's a big load. I have this mashed potato smasher, and I use that to spread the food out, and I use it to smash the food down when I'm done. Again, this is an anaerobic setup. If you have a bunch of air pockets in there, the bacteria aren't going to work as well. There's a bunch of leftover stuffing from the holidays. All right, spread this out a little bit, get it a little more level. I don't need to push as hard on this as I do with making mashed potatoes, so it works out fine for this. Okay, then I want to do some more of the Bokashi bran, kind of this on top of all this, and then I'm going to smash it all down really firmly. Pack it in there, pack it down. And when you do this, it's surprising how much you can fit in a bucket. Just giving it a good pack down. Throw that back in the bin. The Bokashi bran that I have, I store in an airtight container. I have a tote that has a gasket on it, so it's completely airtight. Lid on snug, keeps it airtight, and you can let the Bokashi bran bacteria do its thing. So I'm going to layer this food bran, all the way till it gets to the top. When it gets to the top, I'm going to go ahead and screw that lid on, put it in an area that's not going to freeze or not get too hot if it's the summer. I do my Bokashi composting all in the winter time because I'm too lazy to go out and have a hot composting pile that I have to turn every few days in the freezing cold. I've done it there, been there, done that. I don't want to do it anymore. So the Bokashi, when I take care of that in the winter, I put all my food scraps and my regular composting stuff in these Bokashi buckets. So now this one's full. I can't use it for a few weeks while it's in there continuing to ferment and get broken down. So I have another setup, the exact same setup, but by the time the next one's filled up, this one's ready to be dumped out. And again, I can dump it out in my regular compost, or I can dump it out, or I can just hang on to it for a little bit, or there's what's called a soil farm. You can put it in a soil farm, which last year I'd used a big 30-gallon tote and put a layer of soil, layer of the pre-compost or the Bokashi compost, or a layer of the Bokashi compost, another layer of soil, another layer of Bokashi compost until it filled it up. And I would let that sit for, I let it sit for a month, and then I would give a little bit of a stir to see how things were breaking down. And then when it came springtime and the compost pile started to thaw outside, and I could actually turn it a little bit, and I started moving the soil factory in the 30-gallon tote, and I moved it around and dumped it out, and the stuff was mostly broken down already. It looked like mostly composted stuff. You could still see some things, and it definitely still need to be broken down a little bit. But I was able to dump it in my compost, and it disappeared in no time at that point. All right, so there's a handful of things I realized I forgot to talk about as I was cleaning things up. I fortunately remembered then. I haven't put everything away, but I do have a new camera set up over here that I'm going to be talking into. And I'll just go over those things now. So the rice wash that we made with the water and the rice, it's sitting over in a cool, dark place. It's going to be sitting there for a full week. Bacteria. About earlier, I mentioned there are 3 things. I said 2 things that you can't put in there. The Bokashi bin for composting. One is bio waste of any kind. You don't want human or pet waste in there because they putrefy instead of being able to be broken down or fermented. And then you don't want to put moldy things, like I said, and you don't want to put liquids in there. That's why we have the holes in the bottom of the top bucket here, the bottom of this bucket, so the liquid can drain out. Because if there's lots of liquid, then the bacteria that's in the Bokashi bucket can't really do its thing as well. It's not a good environment for them to work in, so things just don't work as well. So we have that hole draining in the rock there to keep it and make sure we have protection keeping it out of any liquid that gathers in the bottom. But you don't want to pour any liquids or oils in there. But I've done smaller bones like chicken bones. I have done rib bones from like baby back ribs, and they just don't break down. So I did the chicken bones just from, I think it was either KFC or some chicken wings or something like that I ate. So smaller bones and bird bones that should break down a little bit faster. They broke down a little bit. They did disappear by the time I was done with the soil factory that I mentioned earlier, but I just prefer not to do bones anymore. It's just not worth it to me. That's I just pull those out and set those in a regular disposal bin. I think that's everything. Or 2 cups of unchlorinated water, 2 cups of 2 cups of 2 cups of unchlorinated water. Okay, just giving it a good smooth, or good, excuse me,